When we were needed, we were there. We were there when we were needed, we were there. No, it wasn't always easy. It wasn't always fair.
The 307th Bombardment Wing fought for 36 consecutive months in the Korean War. Over the next 20 minutes, we'll provide you a narrative based on our research into archives and other sources not well covered in most accounts of the Korean War. You can get a more detailed perspective from all 8 episodes on our website, covering about 3.5 hours. MacDill Air Force Base, Florida was a busy place in 1950. The 307th Bombardment Group had returned victorious in World War II. It was now a key part of America's atomic warfare force, the Strategic Air Command. Communist North Korea invaded democratic South Korea on June 25th, and the Cold War turned hot. The South Korean army collapsed. U.S. ground troops could not halt the North Korean advance. General MacArthur turned to air power to block the communists at the Pusan perimeter. The 307th was one of 5 B-29 bomb groups sent to halt the Reds. Family and loved ones tearfully said goodbye on the MacDill Air Force Base ramp. World War II combat veteran pilot Walter Schlecht piloted the first 307th B-29 to depart. It landed at Kadena on August 1st, and the last of 30 B-29s from the 307th arrived at Kadena August 3rd, and the group conducted its first combat mission on August 7th. The B-29 was a strategic bomber. It was not designed for close air support, but their 20,000 pounds of bombs proved devastating to North Korean troops on the Pusan perimeter. Day after day for over a week, B-29s killed enemy soldiers, destroyed their guns, and blew up ammunition and supplies. The B-29s then turned to strategic bombing to destroy North Korea's war-making potential. The 307th was incredibly good at it. From late August to mid-October, they hit every assigned target. No communist fighters opposed these strikes, and the enemy's meager flak was ineffective. The airmen of the 307th did all this while living in squalor in a tent city. Okinawa in the summer is hot, wet, smelly, and insect-infested. When a typhoon threatened, they had to strike tents, and in the sometimes cold winter, the heavy canvas barely kept out the elements. Crews had to double as bomb loaders and wrench turners while taking their turns at KP and guard duty. By September, they had destroyed most strategic targets in North Korea. The 307th turned to interdiction missions. UN troops broke out of the Pusan perimeter and landed at Incheon. As they marched north, the 307th supported their advance all the way to the Yalu River. In mid-October, victory seemed at hand. UN forces routed North Korean troops and destroyed their air force. The mission for the B-29s seemed complete. The 307th received stand-down orders and began packing up to return to MacDill. Everyone looked forward to celebrating Thanksgiving at home with family. But the 307th would not celebrate the most American of holidays in sunny Florida. Amid the bitterest cold winter on the peninsula, 200,000 Chinese combat soldiers poured across the Yalu River. The Red Hordes sent UN forces into a deliberate withdrawal south. The communists recaptured Seoul. UN forces formed a defensive line just south of the Han River. MacArthur again turned to air power to avoid a rout. He ordered a maximum effort by B-29s, targeting the Korean side of the Yalu River bridges. The Chinese now hid their troops and their supply points in North Korean towns and villages. Air Force General Stratemeyer translated MacArthur's directive into a more explicit order: burn those cities to the ground. The 307's airmen were pissed. They would not be home for Thanksgiving. They wouldn't even be in Tampa Bay by Christmas Day. So they turned to accomplishing their new mission with renewed vigor. The 307th incendiary campaign in November included strikes on 6 cities. But enemy flak was no longer meager and ineffective against America's B-29s. Flak envelopes thickened. They could reach out from their sanctuary in China well into North Korea. Communist guns ranged more than 9 miles and reached 34,000 feet altitude. Flak now covered the entire B-29 flight envelope. These guns were doubly lethal because Russians commanded them. The closer the 307th flew to the Yalu, the more damage the communist flak batteries inflicted. And the Reds sprung a surprise on November 10th. On that fateful day, the 307th suffered the first B-29 shot down by a MiG-15 over North Korea. Russian pilots had been secretly training Chinese airmen in Manchuria, and this time Russian jet aces themselves crossed the Yalu hungry for a kill. The 307th crew was able to bail out but were immediately captured. Their North Korean captors marched them off to prison camps for the remainder of the war. The 307th had stumbled into a lethal zone, MiG Alley. From that date on for a year, B-29 missions would rarely take them again into MiG Alley. December brought a hearty Christmas celebration at Kadena. The 307th delivered presents to North Korean military headquarters in Pyongyang with a special shipment of 4,000-pound bombs brought in for the occasion. In January 1951, commanders announced a rotation policy that would begin replacing combat crews and support airmen with fresh troops. Morale picked up, but by the end of March, combat effectiveness dropped. The new crews had minimal experience and would take a while to become proficient. So the Air Force assigned high priority to developing innovative technology for the air war in Korea, and radar-directed bombing was one of the most effective. 2 radar systems helped B-29s overcome communist opposition. Short-range ground radar enabled B-29s to provide ground forces with close air support at night. A ground controller 10 kilometers behind the front lines marked his target on a map. His radar followed the bomber while he radioed course corrections to the pilot. The radar controller used the same computing devices the bombardier used to determine the drop point. He gave a 10 count and the command "bombs away" over the radio. The bombardier could place his bombs within 1,000 yards of forces in enemy contact. Ground troops had an insatiable appetite for these X-ray missions. The 307th flew these sorties as part of almost every mission. The other system was SHORAN. This was a longer-range radar linked with a transponder and analog computer in the B-29 for interdiction missions. The aircraft followed a radar beam more than 100 miles to the target. SHORAN equipment gave the operator on board the aircraft the plane's precise position in relation to the arc of the radar beam. Then the bombardier could drop bombs within 500 yards of the designated aim point, through clouds and in darkness. But communist air power was building rapidly. The Chinese now had over 600 MiG-15s of their own. They were rapidly gaining proficiency under the secret Soviet training teams. The communists were also busy constructing several new airfields in North Korea to base the aircraft. In the spring of 1951, the Soviets sent their initial fighter regiments back into Manchuria to train the new Chinese and North Korean pilots inside China. Soviet MiGs themselves flew across the Yalu to attack American B-29s, but this time there was a new crew of MiG-15 pilots in the skies over North Korea. The Soviets replaced them with their top fighter regiments from Moscow. World War II's top ace, Colonel Ivan Kozyedov, commanded. The 307th lost a B-29 to these combat veterans on April 7, 1951, and another on April 12th. They bombed the Sunui-Ju-Yalu River Bridge both times. The 19th group lost 5 B-29s on the 12th, and BombCom took Sunui-Ju off the target list for now. Target and operations planners began working up a new operational concept. But 307th gunners made the communists pay a high price on the 12th. The deadly caliber .50 marksmanship of Staff Sergeant Richard Fisher and Sergeant David Stein killed 2 MiGs that day. The last of the original combat crews finally rotated home in May. The 307th's new crews were gaining painful experience in trials by fire. But by the end of April, bombing expertise was up, morale was high, and maintenance levels returned to the 80% availability rates of 1950. Despite the start of armistice talks in June 1951, the communists continued to build up their air defenses. Russians trained more Chinese and North Korean MiG-15 pilots. In October 1951, Soviet MiGs suddenly came out in force. This time, their Chinese and North Korean apprentices came along. The 307th, mission number 289, on October 23rd, was to strike the airfield under construction at Namsi. The bomb run took them over another new airfield at Taechon. At that point, an undercast made visual bombing impossible, but rather than proceed to an alternate target, the mission commander decided to stay steady on the bomb run. They switched to SHORAN to drop bombs with precision on the 3 Namzi airfield aim points. 307th pilots were proficient with SHORAD, but only 3 of the 9 aircraft had the onboard equipment. They approached with 3 flights in a via-V's formation. The left and right aircraft following lead would drop bombs when they reached the unseen drop point beneath the clouds at the end of a 10 count. They had practiced it a dozen times in training and on some previous missions. Namzi was too important to leave untouched. But Taichan was teeming with newly deployed flak guns. The 307th's lead aircraft took several hits and began to fall out of formation. The pilot regained control of the aircraft and continued to target. As the disrupted formation approached Namzi, 150 MiGs swarmed around the 307th's 9 bombers and their fighter escorts. The skies over Namzi turned into a complex furball of enormous dimensions. The Chinese and North Koreans stood off to track the action, prepared to pursue any stray bombers on their way down. One Soviet group kept the F-86 escorts decisively engaged miles away and far above. Another group of MiG-15s piloted by the Soviet Union's top guns outclassed the F-84s flying close escort for the B-29s. The 307th pushed through the milieu and dropped their bombs, and 2 gunners were each certified with a MiG kill on Mission 289. Several more were credited but could not later be confirmed. But it all came at a tragic cost. 3 B-29s fell to the MiGs over the target. 5 more suffered severe damage and casualties, making emergency landings at American bases in South Korea. Only 2 307th bombers returned to Kadena. 29 307th Airmen were killed or missing in action. 11 men bailed. Air Force rescue units recovered 1 body at sea. The Communists captured the other 10, but repatriated only 5. 26 307th Airmen listed as missing from Mission 289 remain unaccounted for to this day. And B-29s would not bomb again in daylight formation using visual targeting until a new round of adaptations enabled more effective methods. After Mission 289, night bombing immediately became the principal method for interdiction and airfield missions. It was not easy. For one thing, navigation charts were from the Japanese occupation era for ground troops. They were not accurate for precise shore-ran bombing. U.S. intelligence photo analysts had to correct them based on stereo photography. Then they had to distribute them in large quantities. Also, there was a shortage of B-29 shore-ran equipment, so only the most proficient crews had it. The 307th overcame all those issues and returned to Namsi 7 more times in October and November, and the wing lost not a single bomber in those missions. 1951 was a tragic time for the 307th Bombardment Wing, but the airmen of the 307th gave no counsel to fear. They flew into 1952 a seasoned combat outfit, eager to fly. They took the fight to the enemy each and every day. They arose, flew, and fought the next day. They did it again and again, as many times as necessary, to defeat the Communists. On the other side of the Yellow River, at the end of 1952, Soviet jet pilots could barely meet their mission requirements. Many suffered from combat stress and were sent back home. Sick call and medical profile roles grew. The Soviets had to rotate their fighting regiments back to Moscow, and this time their replacements were less experienced. The U.S. Air Force rotation policy averted large numbers of medical and psychological absences, but the downside was that each new cohort had to go through an initial period of orientation, and it was a few weeks before they gained the proficiency of their predecessors. The greater challenge was that the interdiction campaign was not producing results. Between August 1951 and March 1952, Far Eastern Air Forces lost 256 combat aircraft but received only 131 replacements. That was a losing attrition rate, and the Communists were rebuilding their lines of communication and airfields faster than Bomber Command could disrupt them. Headquarters planners and analysts went to work on new tactics, techniques, and procedures. The answer was already there in an operations study completed by staff back in April. Their recommendation was to give up the attempt to sustain continuous disruption of all supply lines. Destruction of only critical points was the path to victory. The generals now agreed. target list changed, aiming to kill troop concentrations, destroy command centers, and defeat communications infrastructure. And headquarters now added a strategic element. Analysts calculated that North Korea's hydroelectric grid was vulnerable to destruction of a few key nodes that would bring down the entire network. And both China and Russia were dependent on electricity from North Korea to service their eastern regions. Air Force R&D updated the World War II tactic of dropping chaff, special strips of metal foil to confuse enemy radar. B-29 crews could drop chaff before dropping bombs. They capitalized on the fact that B-29 electronic warfare operators had recorded nearly every radar and radio frequency the communists used. By using just the right foil strips, this World War II tactic deflected radar signals such that 9 B-29s in formation or in a stream would appear on radar screens as hundreds. Chaff produced so much disruption that it took a while for Russian controllers to get a precise lock on a bomber. Bombcom also leveraged its close relationship to Strategic Air Command to get 4 more SHORAN stations transferred from the U.S. to the Korean War. 6 SHORAN stations increased the options for bombing tactics by an order of magnitude. The 307th would be able to make multiple bomb runs simultaneously on the same target. And those bomb runs could be along multiple directions on variable time schedules. They could even approach simultaneously from opposite directions. And the 307th became the best B-29 wing in the Korean War at employing these tactics, techniques, and procedures. The first mission to apply these concepts was Operation Pressure Pump in July 1952. The 307th destroyed the main supply center and military headquarters complex at Pyongyang. Then the Korean War Long Rangers scored 17 direct hits on the Chosin hydroelectric plant on July 21st-22nd. This took out power across the peninsula for 2 weeks. At the end of July, the 307th fought off 87 MiGs and destroyed a metals plant. No MiG scored a hit on any 307th bomber. At the end of August 1952, the 307th's in-commission rate was back at the top of Bombcom's chart at 78%, and no other wing could touch the 307th's 97.5% SHORAN bombing effectiveness rate. But the Soviets had their own innovations. They brought in longer range and more accurate radars. They could now acquire a B-29 200 miles away, and it also allowed MiGs to close to within 500 meters of a B-29 in flight. They also deployed powerful searchlight that could illuminate a B-29 up to 30,000 feet altitude. Together, these innovations enabled the Communists to down one 307th B-29 in September 1952. Worse, they recovered its SHORAN charts from the wreckage. The Soviets developed an uncanny ability to engage B-29s with MiG-15s at night. The MiGs had no onboard radar or infrared, although those technologies were in development in the Soviet Air Force. Their TTP in Korea instead relied on the new early warning radar that allowed them to time the arrival of bombers at anticipated targets. Specially selected MiG night fighter pilots were trained for these missions. If they guessed right at which target was up, dozens of searchlight operators could scan the skies with their beams. They searched in patterns until they lit up a bomber's underside or vertical stabilizer. Once tracked and caught in the headlight, nearby MiG night fighter pilots could make visual contact and engage the B-29 without direction from a ground controller. American planners jumped ahead of the Soviets' new methods by making 2 more changes to B-29 TTP. First, they simply painted the undersides of their B-29s with black paint. That made it difficult for ground searchlight operators to see a B-29 at night. Secondly, B-29s spread out laterally and vertically on the bomb run. Up to 9 bombers approached simultaneously from opposite direction. Each bomber was blind to the target as well as to other aircraft. So long as each bomber followed its assigned SHORAN arc at its designated time, risk of mid-air collision was minimal. The result was that exposure of the entire mission to enemy searchlights, flak, and fighters was down to as low as 1 minute. By the end of November 1952, the 307th destroyed its nemesis, the Wiju airfield, using the new SHORAN techniques. The Communists made one last push to deploy hundreds more flak guns. The 307th lost one more B-29 to enemy action. Unexpected contrails on a moonlit night in January 1953 allowed lucky searchlight operators to lock in. The crew bailed, and the Communists repatriated all but one at the end of the war. Thus, the 307th ironically lost the first and the last B-29s of the Korean War. They also executed the final B-29 bomb mission on the night of July 26, 1953. The 307th's box score for the war was remarkable. Over 36 months, they executed 6,052 sorties to a 96.7 overall effectiveness rate. They lost 12 B-29s to combat, and 153 airmen were killed or missing in action. The Communists returned 34 307th POWs to military custody in Operation Big Switch after the signing of the armistice. And finally, in Operation Glory in September 1954, the Communists returned the remains of 45 Long Rangers who died in captivity. The conflict was over, but certainly is not forgotten. To this day, 73 airmen from the 307th remain unaccounted for. We owe our best efforts to bring closure to them, their families, and the nation.